Hello and welcome to the release of Harvard University's annual State of the Nation's Housing Report. I am Chris Arnold. I'm a reporter and correspondent with National Public Radio. I cover economics generally, and I in particular have covered the housing market for the past 5, 7, 8 years probably as things have gotten wild and crazy there. We've got a great panel today, really a tremendously wonderful group of folks to talk about this, and there's a lot to talk about. Online viewers can tweet their questions using the hashtag Harvard Housing Report, and you can email your questions to jchs@harvard.edu. So that's JCHS is for the Joint Center for Housing Studies at harvard.edu. On our panel, first to my left here, we have Eileen Fitzgerald, and she is the Chief Executive Officer of NeighborWorks America. And if you know NeighborWorks, you know that means that she works with 300-400 different community organizations around the country. Many of them are focused on housing, and they interact with about 4,000 different neighborhoods around the United States. So we're lucky to have your perspective on everything that's going on in the housing market and where we're at in this recovery. Next, we have Debra Still, who is the chairman of the Mortgage Bankers Association and also the CEO of Pulte Mortgage. Pulte Home Building is one of the largest home builders in the country. So Debra has a lot of background and experience in the world of mortgage finance. And that's something that, looking forward, we're at a point in U.S. history where we're redefining the role the government's going to play in housing and in mortgage finance. So I think it's great to have you here today. There's a lot going on in Washington right now, or at least being talked about in Washington right now, to see what happens next there. And finally, we've got George McCarthy, who is a director at the Ford Foundation in New York. And George comes at the issue of urban poverty from a bunch of different angles, one of which has very much to do with housing. He's also interested in finding people jobs, what kind of transportation makes sense. So he brings a good, varied perspective to all of this as well. And George is also an economist. He can help us keep Eric Belsky in line if there's any outrageous economic claims made. We can handle that. So Eric is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and the School of Design, and he also heads up the Joint Center for Housing Studies. He's worked in housing and mortgage finance in both the public and private sector and held senior positions at Fannie Mae and the National Association of Home Builders and other institutions. He also advises policymakers in Washington on housing issues. And having taken a class with Eric at Harvard recently, I can say he's a very good professor. So. And,
highest praise.
Yeah. So my first question is actually for Eric. And we're going to bring up our first slide of our webcast here, which shows a housing market that's recovering. The black line you can see there is the pace of existing residential home sales, and you could see it collapsed as the housing bubble burst. It came up a couple times with those federal tax credits, collapsed again, and then now over the past year or so, it's been steadily climbing back up. Similar we see for, I think it's new home sales. Is that the?
Yeah, that's the blue line.
The blue one is
no, we have housing starts.
Housing starts is the
orange prices.
Anyway, several different indicators showing things are moving up, but they're still down from their peaks. Looking at all these data points, I ask Eric, have we come to the point where we can say confidently we are in a sustainable housing recovery?
Well, I think clearly we're in a strong housing recovery now. On the rental side, we've actually been in a recovery for 3 full years. Rents have been rising for 3 years. Rental vacancy rates have been falling. Renter household growth, with all the challenges that have been encountered in home ownership, has been strong, 2 times its kind of trend growth. So we've seen a strong rebound in the rental market. That's been ongoing. It continues to be sustained. We're seeing a pickup in construction. The big news, of course, is that 2012 really was turning a page on the for-sale market and a recovery in home prices. And what we're seeing there is 2012 versus 2011, we were up 9% on existing home sales. We were up 20% on new home sales. if you look at the most recent numbers that recently came out in May, the momentum's even picking up from there. So existing home sales are 13% up year over year. New home sales are up more like 29% year over year, and we're seeing strong gains in home prices, 15% in the median price. The recently released Case-Shiller index showed 12% April over April. And we have very tight inventories, and the numbers on new home sales are particularly interesting because they're based on when contracts are signed. That includes May, and May was a month, obviously, where rates had already started to go up. And we saw a strong increase in sales despite that growth in interest rates. So when you see a market that's continuing to chug through, even with interest rate increases, which normally represents some form of drag, it means there's a larger momentum pushing things forward than whatever drag may be created. And in some level, that increase in interest rates, because things are still so affordable, may have done more to get people off the fence and into the market than actually held the market back.
Right, that, you know, people who were thinking about buying a house now say, uh-oh, rates aren't 3.25, they're 4.5. Maybe I do have to jump now, and that there is some of that.
Yeah, precisely. And you know, we've looked at this question of how much more would rates have to go up to bring the median home price back in line, or the median mortgage payment back in line with median incomes relative to home prices. And you could see interest rates rise significantly from here. By our estimate, you'd have to get to 7% before you'd start making housing really a binding constraint in terms of affordability. Nationally, of course, it varies by market.
Okay, and if new home sales and housing starts are rising sharply, that's great for the overall economy, because there are a lot of people who work in the construction business, and we start to see gains like 29%. That makes a huge difference for, I mean, you'd seen in the overall GDP numbers, so that's
right.
something.
And so where we've been is, you know, we also have an improvement in remodeling spending. People are spending more in their homes, and this should especially pick up with prices starting to recover. But I think you have to be cautious in explaining that these percentage gains are off of a very low level, as you can see in some of those charts. And so what it basically means is they've come back strongly. We're well into a recovery phase. But there's still a lot of upside relative to anything that we would consider normal or trend-like in terms of the number of sales, the number of starts, and especially household growth, which for 5 years was in and around 600,000 or below. And we had never seen anything like that, and it went on for 5 years. To us, trend growth is around 1.2 million. Last year, we finally got about 1 million households to form in the United States. So we're just starting to see the potential updraft in the market, and you know, I think all eyes are to see, will that increase in interest rates, you know, continue, or will it start to settle down, and you know, just how strong a recovery will this continue to be in this space?
Well, and I think, I mean, clearly then we're seeing sales are going up, prices are going up, construction's going up, more jobs. That all sounds very good. My hope as a reporter is that at the same time this becomes the story that we talk about sort of as journalists when we think about the housing market, that we don't forget that there's still a lot of people who are in trouble in the world of housing. And I like this chart that Eric has put together for some presentations that he does, where this shows the increase in people facing foreclosure, basically, or extremely delinquent loans. And you can see that peaks during the crash and soon afterwards. And now today, even as the housing market's recovering, those numbers are still pretty high up there. So we've still got 2-3 million Americans facing foreclosure. I could guess and say half. Maybe they wouldn't have to be foreclosed on if we could reach them with really effective loan modifications and other things. That's something I've reported on a lot. I think it's a big issue. What's your thought where we stand?
So you know, I like the way you frame that very much. You know, we care about housing deeply at the center. We study all aspects of it. We cover many different topics, as you know, in the State of the Nation's Housing Report. And I think there is the risk that not just, you know, the press moves on, the public moves on, and more important, policymakers move on. When you see the strength of the recovery, how it's beneficial for the economy, that you can lose track of a number of things that we consider to be lasting problems. So this shows, in part, you know, it peaked out at about 4.3 million people who are in foreclosure or past 90 days due on their loans. Now we're back down to something more like 2.5, 2.6 million. So we're half of the levels we were, but as you can see there, we're still at, you know, roughly 4 times the trend level that we had seen before that. And so it's not only a lot of damage to those households and really difficult personal situations, but it has impacts, on their ability in the future to be able to access credit. We'll talk about, I hope, at some point how tight credit's become, so it has that implication. But a really lasting damage is that there have been a lot of homes lost to foreclosures that are sitting out there abandoned, that have been vacant for more than 2 years, and trying to turn communities around, which we call hardest hit communities that have large proportions of these units, is a serious issue for the nation, and one that really very few resources are flowing to. And it's very hard for the private market to go into a place where you have 15, 20% of the units that are abandoned and have been vacant for some time. It becomes a public policy issue. And I think as attention moves towards the recovery, which is great and important, very important for the economy, and represents an opportunity for a lot of Americans to buy homes at low prices and low interest rates that are affordable to them, that will also be lasting. There are these issues that are serious and we think need to be addressed. The other thing we cover, of course, in the report is cost burdens have gone up. The number of people who are shouldering very heavy cost burdens for housing, spending more than half their income, is up really sharply. And so, if you look at it, we now have close to 21 million households, or about 18% of all households, are spending more than half their income on housing. That's a lot. It shows that people value housing, they understand its importance, they're willing to pay more and more for it, but the more and more they pay for housing, the less they have to spend on other things in the economy, and the greater and greater strain it is on them. And it's moving up the income scale. It's gone up even in the group that earns 3 to 4 times the minimum wage. It's up by over 500,000 over the last 10 years. And we're talking millions and millions of households. Over that last 10 years, we've increased the number facing these cost burdens by about 6.5, 7 million households.
And we've got some slides about that too. With Eileen, we're going to talk about that too. One more question before we move on from Eric. Briefly, okay, so some Americans are still struggling, but home prices have fallen a lot. And how affordable is housing in the United States now for how many people? I mean, granted, there's different things in different markets, but overall, is it a good time to buy a house? Has it gotten extremely affordable?
It's gotten extremely affordable. So we're off record levels of affordability by almost any measure. The records were reached when you might expect, when interest rates were really at their lowest point. And we've now seen mortgage interest rates rise by almost 100 basis points, almost a full percentage point. So it's a significant increase. Even with that significant increase of a percentage point, one very often quoted measure, and one that we talk about, is the National Association of Realtors, which compares median incomes to median home prices and assumes that it's affordable, if it doesn't absorb more than 25% of your income, to buy that median priced home. Well, we were at the place where people could buy a home that was twice the price of a median priced home, even though they only had the median income, and it would still absorb 25% or less of their income. Now we're down to maybe something more, by our estimates, the new numbers haven't come out yet, more in the range of you could buy a house that's 1.6 times the median price. That's very affordable. And when you look at the first-time home buyer index, which is less reported on, but assumes someone has an income at 65% of the median income, because first-time buyers have less income, and a home price, however, that's 85% of the median income, so you're assuming much less income but only a smaller reduction in price. That number had never been above the rate where people would be only having to allocate 25% to it under an assumption of a 10% down payment. Now we're at a place where it went up to, they could buy a home that was 1.3 times the median first-time buyer type price home. And even with the interest rates, we're still over 100 on that index, so meaning that you could still afford it. So it's a very affordable time to buy a home. And I think, we've hit a reset button and prices start to appreciate. Rents certainly have been appreciating. You have a lot of investors seeing an opportunity, seeing prices lower than what it would cost to rent. All this basically indicates, we're still in an affordable zone. And as I said, interest rates would have to go up by, another close to 300 basis points before you would find affordability to be a binding constraint. Does that mean that some people won't get prices on the market, especially first-time buyers, or that it is to some degree some drag of where we would otherwise be? No, I think it is. But it's not sufficient to be a real major concern. And when you look at, prices in some markets come up 25%, but those are, in those same markets, they're still 50% off their peaks.
Right. Well, so, and here I thought we could kind of quickly go around the panel and just, this is a big kind of news issue in the last week or so. Ben Bernanke has said, okay, the economy's recovering, we might start to back away support, from the mortgage system, and rates are going up. Eric's not too concerned. At the same time, you could get a 3.25% interest rate in a 30-year fix not too long ago. Now it's 4.5%. I was reading yesterday that Wells Fargo just set that. I mean, it's more than 100 basis points jump in a short period of time. Why don't we start with Eileen and just go around and quick thoughts. Is this something you're concerned about? What happens next with interest rates? Or not? I'm not to predict, but how concerned are you?
Do that. Well, sure. We care a lot about lower income and minority communities. So wages have not gone up. So while things will still be affordable and certainly better than a super high interest rate environment, being able to less people will be able to afford. I think equally we're very concerned about movements in tight credit, higher down payments, and certainly any step back from a 30-year fixed mortgage, right? So probably even more important than interest rates staying down is keeping a 5% down payment for buyers who go through home buyer education counseling and then otherwise prepared. You change that to 20%, you've cut out everybody. It doesn't really matter what the interest rate is.
You mean these QRM or the QM or whatever it is, the
Exactly.
rules that would make, instead of just having a 5% down payment for an FHA loan, you might have to pay 20% down or 10% down, and that could really make it hard for people to,
Right.
Okay.
It's pretty clear. If you impose those kinds of down payment requirements, you would have a very chilling effect because so few people are in a position to put 20% down, even 10% down.
We can talk about why that's not necessary.
Yeah.
Right.
And Debra, what's your take on
Yeah,
interest rates?
so I think we all expected rates to go up and go up gradually. I think the last week with some of the Fed's announcements has created a level of volatility that is probably not a true reflection of an increase in rates as much as uncertainty around the Fed moves. So I think we all agree with Eric that we've got a long bandwidth before a rise in interest rates would negatively impact this recovering housing environment. But in the short run, it's creating a lot of urgency with consumers on contract and creating a lot of uncertainty, maybe getting some folks off the fence. Although I think the concern from the consumer was anticipation of the Fed meeting, not so much since the Fed meeting. And I think we'll see, we've already seen even in the last couple days, things recover a little bit.
Okay. And Mac, you?
So I think that it's not really sensitivity to interest rates that's going to dictate whether or not people become homeowners. And everybody's been talking about things like down payment, but it's actually just the absolute kind of access or lack of access to credit. And right now, in the report, you'll see that the average denial was for someone with a 729 credit score. Mm-hmm. Now, that's very high up in the distribution of credit score ranges, and so who can actually get financing is probably more relevant than whether or not the financing is 50 basis points higher or even 150 basis points higher. And this is really important because we're at extraordinary levels of affordability, right? And it's a little bit less affordable than it was like last year, but we're talking about affordability that is, markets are more affordable than they were 40 years ago. And now we just dangle out that opportunity with no ability for anybody to kind of close the deal, which is very tragic, especially given the fact that we just went through a massive destruction of wealth, particularly for low-income and minority homeowners over the last 5 or 6 years. So to offer people the ability to, or at least the alleged ability to grow wealth, and then to not allow them to be able to get back into the market is cruel, I have to say.
And I just say we keep hearing about inventory problems on the ground. All cash investors, whether those be institutional investors or local investors, are taking away that opportunity for especially because credit is tight, but perfectly qualified new home buyers just don't get access to those properties because the seller will go for an all-cash execution versus credit. So we're missing a huge opportunity to let those families really get a stake in their community, and that's something we're very worried about.
And I think to your point, you've got rising rates for the moment, and then hopefully slowly over the long term, but you've got such a tight inventory environment right now that rising sales prices and rising rents are driving every bit as much urgency as a rising interest rate.
And we've talked about this in the long run since when you look at how much building has gone on, when you roll in all the incredibly depressed years of production for home building, we're at a 10-year low point when you add it up over 10 years. So you could argue that we're in a position where we're going to have tight markets, which, you know, help for recovery, but at some point, you know, they're driving price and rent increases that are beyond what you would normally get from income growth. It's not a great thing. But our view is similar in terms of the credit constraints are really the key issue. And we talked about down payment, and Mac mentioned credit scores. You know, the average credit score is around 700. When you look at the first-time buying population, which is critical, which is the group between 25 and 34 years old, about 2/3 of them have a credit score under 700, and very few loans, by our estimates, somewhere around 1 in 10 people are getting loans have credit scores under 700, yet among the first-time buying population, it's about 2/3 of that population. Those are, you know, serious issues. They're potentially binding issues, and it's especially challenging for people with low incomes and minorities who have, on average, lower credit scores.
Well, this might be a time too to turn to Debra and ask. You know, I was going to ask you this a little bit later, but since it's
Sure.
come up, access to credit. What is driving lender behavior now? Why is the spigot so tight if it is? And as prices, you know, if prices continue to rise consistently, if the climate gets more predictable, would you expect that spigot to open up more so more American families can buy these houses that are so affordable?
Yeah, interesting question. Credit is overly tight. I think we'd all agree, and all the data would suggest that. I think if you look at what's driving lender behavior in today's environment, in large part, it's from some of the very much needed clarity on reps and warrants with investors and in particular the GSEs. And so the putback issue has driven behavior to want to manufacture the perfect loan, if you will. We've also had extraordinary enforcement actions and extraordinary enforcement headlines that will also drive lender behavior. What is most challenging for me is that's today's environment. In January of next year, we have the first of the Dodd-Frank rules going into effect, and the ability to repay rule with the definition of QM is going to also potentially restrict credit to deserving borrowers at the lower end of the spectrum. So we have yet to deal with the behavior as a result of regulation. And if you look at, you know, in the report, what was most interesting to me is with all of the encouraging statistics on household growth and the future of housing, we have to ask ourselves the question, will financing be available? And whether it's multifamily or single family, are we going to have financing for a very diverse, lots of protected classes, low to moderate income, the low-end first-time home buyer? And that's the group that, if you look at the housing growth right now, it's the high end of the market that's growing, not the low end. The low end of the market's actually shrinking.
But this gets to kind of a fundamental question about who we are as a country, because we've defined ourselves, at least since the Great Depression, as a country of homeowners. Homeownership rates, as you mentioned in the report, are falling. They're down at 1994 levels now, and it won't be long before we're down into 1980 levels if they go at the rate they're going. And we're really reverting to a very different culture. And we have to decide, I think, as a public policy question, is that where we want to go?
Yeah, I think that's a crucial question. I mean, I was taking class with Eric because I did a fellowship at Harvard this past year, and that was the big question I wanted to explore was, wait a minute, you know, right now in Washington, we're starting to rethink the American dream when it comes to home ownership, and there's a lot of stuff happening, and the changes that are made are going to make a really big difference for this type of stuff. I was going to turn to Mac actually to ask you to talk a little bit about the importance of home ownership, where we stand with that, what you would like to see coming next, and how you're dealing with some of these issues of tight credit and the changing composition of home buyers, and you know, what are you doing in the midst of all this right now? Where do you see the challenges?
Well, that's about 17 questions. So let me say, I'll start with some of the easy ones. I think that, you know, it's been fundamentally, I mean, it's been a fact for a long time in the United States that the bulk of the wealth, particularly of low and moderate income families, is held in their homes. And if you look at the tables in the back of the report, you'll see the difference between the net worth of homeowners and the net worth of renters is profound. It's like 8 or 10 to 1 or something. I don't remember the exact numbers, but And for low-income people, almost all of their wealth is held in their home if they're homeowners, because they're not, they're not diversified into 401ks and all these other kinds of investments. And that was a bargain we made as a way to get out of the Great Depression. We actually created the housing finance system then as a way to kind of, in some ways, avert revolution, because we were at a point at which millions of people were losing their houses and no bank would lend then either, right? One of the important things about that is that the distribution of income and wealth following the Great Depression leveled considerably as a result of a whole bunch of public policies that actually made it possible for people to build wealth. It made it possible, mostly white people, by the way, but made it possible for people to build wealth and to also grow incomes as a result of building this gigantic system called the housing development, financing, construction system. We're in a very different place. We've come out of this Great Recession now with worse distribution of wealth than we had before it. We come out with worse distribution of income than we had before it. There's no great leveling, and there's no promise to the population that there's going to be something that we're going to be able to provide as a society to kind of, heal those wounds that were created as a result of bad behavior by a lot of people. And we don't need to point fingers. So where are we going to go with that? I don't know, because we're really on a precipice. If QM, which is pretty much settled, goes into effect, and there's not a lot bad about QM except for the idea that we might have to have down payment standards. But basically, one of the big things about QM is that there's the ability to repay, which is probably good. But if they move from QM to QRM and then say we're going to have minimum down payments, we're going to have a different kind of underwriting that's that limits the access of most of the people we care about to home ownership, then we're not just going to have kind of a class problem, we're going to have a civil rights problem as well. Because if you look at the distribution of income and wealth for minorities, their ability to put down even 5% of down payment is very, very limited. And we've just destroyed their wealth through this last recession, and we've now limited their access to credit going forward. The homeownership rates for the African Americans are down to 1994 levels. Yes. For Hispanic Americans, it's in 97 levels, and they're like less than 50%. The gap between white homeownership rates and Hispanic and African American homeownership rates is the largest it's ever been. So anyway, I mean, these are big issues. And so what are we doing? Well, what we're doing is we're advocating very, very strongly, like I am right now, right? We're making sure that there's access and affordability of housing finance going forward, so we don't lock out people from the thing that builds wealth, which is house price appreciation. We've been looking at house price appreciation now starting, possibly accelerating. And if people can't get in now, they're not going to enjoy the fruits of that and be able to build wealth over the long term.
Well, and to Mac's point, it's a kind of an urgent, on this score, it's an urgent thing because, you're missing out on a potentially golden opportunity to buy and build wealth. There's nothing else that a low-income person, middle-income person is going to be able to borrow money to invest in. People don't lend large sums of money to the middle class and to lower-income people to buy stocks on margins, and that's a good thing. But I think that you can do it to buy a home, and you got to live in a home anyway. And right now, rents in most markets for a comparable home are above what your mortgage payment would be. So if you're going to have to make that payment anyway, and this way you have an opportunity to build wealth, and we're not where we were in 2006. We're now more at the bottom of something looking up than at the top of something looking down. So there's an irony to the fact that this is the time. And when you look historically, low-income people were typically priced out of the market at the top, and would get in at the bottom of the market. And this time, they were able to get in at the top with very lax lending standards applied by investors, and at the bottom of the market they can't.
And I want to work in one more question for Eileen before we go to questions from the audience. And I think this ties in very directly to owning versus renting. And obviously owning, you're paying down a mortgage, you're building wealth. The other thing you're doing is you're locking in a fixed payment with a fixed loan. Over time, inflation's always going to be there, so you're actually going to be paying less and less going forward versus renting. You're paying more and more going forward. This to me is also why a lot of stories in the media a few years ago that said, oh, home ownership doesn't make any sense anymore. I think a lot of that was not very well thought out. But here's a chart that shows the burden on households of what it paid, of what they have to pay to stay in their house, owning versus renting. And you can see the ones on the left, the cost of renting is just shot up, you know. And I wanted to ask Eileen, how do you deal with this? I mean, at the same time, we have the sequester. There's limits on on rental assistance. I mean, this must be a big issue that you're dealing with right now. Or?
Yeah, so, you know, our organizations are in all 50 states, communities across the country, and, you know, each real estate market is different. But really what is not different is that we have an income problem where housing costs way more than a lot of people have. You know, in the report it says 5.3 million units there's a gap in the supply of the affordable units versus what people can afford. I mean, that's a huge gap to fill. You know, 1/4 of folks eligible for rental assistance, so their income says they're eligible, get it. So 3/4 don't. So that's why you wind up with this situation. And I think what's happening because of sequestration and budget challenges, both at the federal and state level, is, you know, the subsidy is drying up. So going forward for new development, there's less to put in. So that means it costs more to operate the project and pay your debt service. So you can't, you know, you can't rent to the same folks. But even things like Section 8 and rental assistance in USDA, because the market rent is going up, even for you know, it's costing more just to serve the same people who are in the system. So as they increase those budgets and those appropriations, they're actually not serving more folks. And one of the things we've heard from some of our groups around the country on both the rental assistance from USDA and Section 8 is, you know, what I would call, you know, the penny wise, pound foolish approach. So cutting back, saying, okay, don't fund reserves in your rental housing complex. So what happens when the roof goes, right? Or, you know, just we're going to reduce your rents. Well, that means that what happens is the property doesn't get kept up, or really critical things. So yeah, you might save money this year, but 5 years down the line, you're going to have a bigger problem. And we saw that happen a lot in the 80s. There was a lot of push towards cost containment, and you got to pay for it somehow. So we're worried both at that of kind of the integrity of the projects, but at the bottom line, you know, in Austin now has less very low income people than it used to have. Well, those people are living somewhere and they're working in Austin, right? But what's happened is now they're being pushed out. So their cost burden when you add transportation in to housing is probably even higher. So it's not a tenable solution, and it happens in rural areas and urban areas. It's not, you know, it's not just a big city phenomenon.
You know, we all agree that private capital has to come back into the marketplace, but if we're really talking about broad access and affordability, it does get to the important role of government, which we would agree needs to be smaller, but there is a fundamental purpose for the importance of the FHA program, for example, both single-family and multifamily, creating an affordable financing solution.
And, you know, getting back to this issue of affordability, which I think you're quite right. I mean, one way to try to get a little ahead of this problem is to put people in homes that are now affordable to them, where they're going to buy a home that's, you know, today 22, 23% of their income with a fixed rate mortgage. They lock in the largest part of their housing payment, the mortgage payment, and that's kind of an affordability program the government doesn't have to appropriate money for, that is available, and the only people right now availing themselves of it to a significant degree who are most at risk of not being able to do it, those who can't put significant amounts of money down, are FHA borrowers today. And that program is a large part of the home purchase market. It's a critical support right now. But then there again, the credit scores have tightened dramatically. For some terms I think you use that some of the audience may be aware of, some aren't, put backwards this notion that banks are afraid that if the loan goes wrong, they'll look at something they said that they had done in the process of originating the loan that wasn't exactly right and tell them they have to buy back the loan. So standards are tighter than FHA is requiring because lenders don't want that risk, and they're tighter than Fannie and Freddie Mac require. They don't want that risk. And all of this, as I said, is missing this, you know, potential for people to make that decision. Yes, I'm going to buy a home that is 20% of my income, and I can do it in this environment because prices have gone down so much and interest rates are still so low. You said, you know, they're up 100 basis points, absolutely true. But in any kind of historical view, and when you look at how this translates into a comparison to rent payments, just very favorable time. So that's kind of where
And
we
I don't
are.
think we're going to have a long-term housing recovery without the first-time home buyer.
Yeah.
And then certainly if you look at household growth from the immigrant borrower, we've got to have a viable FHA program. I think, Eric, you know the numbers better than I do, but 78% of the FHA book is first-time home buyer? I mean, that is the execution for the first-time buyer.
And then if you have, first-time home buyers, that frees up some rental, right? Because we're losing stock. 650,000 units have been lost in affordable rental. I mean, we have more people and we have less units.
Well, and all the foreclosures are pushing people into the rental market, obviously.
Right. And right now, 1 out of every 6 single-family homes is a rental. But as prices go up, those investors are going to take their appreciation. They're going to become that. So the rental market's going to tighten. So if we don't find a way to help people get out of the rental market into home ownership, who are ready for it, it's really important that they're ready for it.
And
I
I think at this point I'm going to get in trouble if we don't go to some questions from the audience and from Twitter. So why don't we start? And the process here is going to be, if you can wait for someone with a mic to come and then stand up and say who you are and ask your questions, that'd be great.
So this question came in from email. What's the state of housing in predominantly minority urban communities deeply affected by predatory lending, the crash, and subsequent speculative investment activity? How has this affected the affordability of housing to low-wage earners in those communities?
Well, there certainly is markets around the country where there's not a lot of confidence for home buying because there may be a lot of vacant properties, still a lot of foreclosures, and also really a challenge often on the appraisal side. So even when there is some interest and confidence for buyers to come in, the appraisal industry has gotten very, very conservative in what they're doing. So we'll see in many of those markets some demand, but the property won't appraise out, even though the family can afford it and it underwrites. So it's kind of a combination of what Eric said before, dealing with vacancies. I mean, that's a problem. You really have to address that, but also making sure that credit is available and we're not going crazy on the appraisal side.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the distribution of vacant and abandoned properties around the country, they're very, very heavily concentrated, and they tend to be concentrated in formerly heavily minority dominated areas. But this problem that Eileen is talking about is actually profound in certain areas of the country, like most of the Midwest, a lot of the Rust Belt, older industrial cities, where what you have is you have a decent housing stock that actually can't be sold because to acquire the home, to fix it up to habitable standards, actually brings it beyond the point at which you can actually get an appraisal. And the distance can be big. So, for example, in Detroit, where you can buy a house for $2,500, a nice house, that needs probably $50,000 worth of investment in it, if you wanted to do that and then sell it, it would be very hard to get an appraisal, sometimes over $40,000 for it. So there's a gap of $10,000, $12,000, and in some places the gap can be as much as $40,000 or $50,000 in being able to afford it. So being able to appraise it to get a mortgage. So if we don't build a floor under prices in those places, it's going to be very hard to kind of absorb that stock. But I mean, there's plenty of affordable housing in the country. The problem is they're in places that people don't want to buy it. There's 80,000 vacant units in Detroit alone.
And I'll just add on the lending side, I don't think any of us would ever want to go back to some of the lending practices that caused this problem. By the same token, though, we've got to be very thoughtful about swinging the pendulum too far and finding that perfect balance between consumer protection and broad access to credit for qualified borrowers. So still trying to find that right place. And we've overcorrected a bit.
And I would say in the meantime, because some of these units now are not habitable, they're taken out of the stock. Eileen mentioned a number in the report about how many units that were renting for $400 or less have been lost from the stock. The reality is that the supply of very low-cost housing is tightening and tightening. So what it means is rents are going up. And so the people in these communities, at the same time, they're missing out on an opportunity to buy a home at these very low appraised values and actually get into a lower payment than they would be paying for rent. Don't have that opportunity, and they're paying more rent to be in a neighborhood that has now more problems. And this is a generalization, what's happening nationally. It varies place by place. But it's really, you really have the sense that for low-income housing communities, they're a little bit between a rock and a hard place.
Well, and homeowners had the chance to refinance, whereas renters have just seen their house payment go up.
Correct.
You know, it's useful to think about the actual distribution of rental housing, because most people associate rental housing with big multifamily buildings, but that research that McCarthy did a couple years ago was 52% of rental units are detached single family, and I think it was almost 70% were 1 to 4s, right?
Yeah.
So, and only 20% of that market is actually in buildings of 50 units or more, and those are typically in cities. So the rental market isn't what most people think about when they think about the rental market. And they don't understand the sensitivity of the rental market to things like shifts in interest rates,
Right.
which actually drive up rents, and there's lots of other things that affect rents, and you're completely vulnerable to that when you're a renter because you haven't locked in your payments like you do with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of people say homeownership really at some level can be a hedge against rent inflation as opposed to a way to get appreciation in your home, but it's really, in fact, a little bit of both. In normal times, about a third of all households, a third of all renter households are renting in single-family units. So Mac's quite correct that it's, people have a perception of, apartment buildings, but a large part of the market has been single-family. Of course, we saw a large increase in the share that are living in single-family units and the number of units that are being rented out when you looked at the number that were converted. And this is part of the market adjusting, right? Because you can't get a loan. Some people don't want to buy until they saw prices starting to go up and they see a sort of all clear signal. And that's kind of, I think,
So a neighbor
where
buys
we
it,
are.
turns it into a rental, and they pay cash, and they can do it or whatever.
Right, and it moves on to the rental market, which relieves some of the pressure. What we've seen is, by our estimate, about 3 million units from 07 to 11, and probably more if you roll into 12, were converted 1 to 4 unit properties from a situation where it was owned to rented, but yet still the single family vacancy rate started drifting down, which meant that the demand for rentals was outstripping this large growth. So you still have that tightness, you're still seeing rents go up in the single family market, but if you hadn't seen that adjustment, if investors hadn't come in and played that role, you just would have had a lot of homes for sale driving prices even further down rather than renters being served in the market and an even greater potential increase in rents among that group.
I think we should also try to get to another question from the audience and also acknowledge Research Director Chris Herbert is here, which is great, and also Research Manager Dan McHugh. Both were really instrumental in helping to put the report together, and if there are any reporters who want to go up to them and get some deep understanding of housing, they're here and available to talk. So. And our next question is from another, okay.
This is a question from Twitter. What can or should be done to help the 20+ million households that spend more than half their income on housing?
Well, again, really we need to have more subsidy available to help make those payments. So that's a challenge. It is an income problem. So if they're, either they make more in their wages, but some of that's also then how do we manage rent? So part of the challenge in, it's important to have a robust private market, but unlike maybe in some other countries where homeownership rates are not as high, our country, very few places do we have, some form of rent stabilization, rent control. So some of those families are in that space because they're in a market where people are responding and able to essentially increase that rent, annually at will. So, so given that that's the economy we have, then we have to figure out how do we create more longer-term permanent affordable housing, which implies some form of subsidy, either upfront or ongoing.
I think some of the energy efficiency initiatives also help. Utilities are a very large percent of the total house cost, and so continuing to focus on dropping the utility bills would be very helpful as well. But it is an income problem and a cost of construction problem too. I mean, it's getting very expensive to build.
This is a multifaceted, obviously, issue. And you've heard some of the things we talk in the report about how much more older housing consumes in terms of energy, so it has obviously environmental implications, has carbon emission implications, but really has very important implications for operating costs. And as energy costs seem to be secularly higher and are likely to continue roughly to be there, that can really make a difference, because a non-trivial part, especially if you're in a lower income situation, of your income is actually not paying for the rent or the mortgage payments, paying for utilities to the place. There is the issue of the costs of construction. There's issues of the costs of regulation, the availability of land as a result of regulation, so therefore the cost of land. All those things I think you mentioned are true. I think there is an income problem for some people. Their incomes are just so low that really the only way you can do it is through some kind of subsidy program. There's a number on the table, including a National Housing Trust Fund, which was established but never got funded, to create affordable housing for where the need is really the greatest, at the 30% of area median income. These are people who are making $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a year. So there are those things, but that takes money, and in this current environment, it's difficult to get the money. For some of those in that middle range, and we've seen cost burdens, the share of people spending more than 30% or half their income on housing go up. The likelihood is now, if they were able to get a home loan, several of them could drop themselves below where they were. So that is a potential, but probably reasonably short-lived part of the potential solution.
The other thing is that we know that housing has other benefits to society, right? So kids who live, whether it's rental or home ownership, but where they're in a place that they're not moving all the time, that benefits the school district because they're spending a lot of money on turnover, right? It also makes the child typically more successful in school. Health outcomes, incidences of emergency room visits for asthma for children. They're in good quality rental or home ownership, that goes down. Well, that saves a lot of money to the taxpayer, right? Other forms, finding good transitions where elderly individuals can stay in a rental apartment versus being put in assisted living or other nursing care saves tremendous money. But the way that money gets appropriated and budgeted, we don't get to count those savings. So I think going forward, we really do need to recognize what are those and figure out how we own that, because at the end of the day, we're actually paying less taxpayer dollars if we take advantage of that.
I mean, it's really a public policy issue, but most of the time we focus on the demand side and we say we're going to do something about the incomes of low-income people so they can afford the housing. But there's actually a supply question here as well. I mean, one of the issues is there a public good argument you can make about being able to take a significant share of a local housing stock and get it out of the speculative economy, right? And this is with this permanently affordable stuff. I mean, permanently affordable housing is maintained permanently affordable with a variety of different mechanisms. If it's rental housing, it could be through public housing, it could be through other kinds of constraints like with low-income housing tax credits. If it's owner-occupied housing, it's done with like community land trusts, deed restrictions, other mechanisms to make them permanently affordable, and so that the price of the housing actually tracks wages. Now that takes subsidy up front, but if you were able to find strategies that would get 20 to 25% of the housing stock in an area out of the speculative market, then you don't have the Sturm and Drang that happens when the markets go up and down, and people won't be getting displaced when rents start get driven up, right? And so that's once again, it's a public policy issue. We have to decide, is this important enough for us to kind of reserve a certain portion of the housing stock that would be available for working families? And so one of the things that we've been doing is working on a private effort in this regard with a thing called the Housing Partnership Equity Trust. And basically this is a nonprofit that's actually created a REIT, where they're identifying, especially in high-cost markets, what they call naturally affordable housing. And then they're buying it, and then they're blending philanthropic, nonprofit, and private capital to be able to buy and manage these units.
So they're buying them and fixing them up. I mean, kind of
and
blighted
they're buying
areas.
And fixing them up, and they're keeping them in the affordable stock. And of course, they're mandated to keep them in the affordable stock by the covenants that are put on the money that is provided to them to actually do this work. And they've just gotten started, but they've assembled like $100 million to start buying up properties in various metros around the country. But trying to preserve that stock, because how much of the affordable housing stock just dissipates every year?
Right. So over a 10-year period on the rental side, it's 13%. Just so,
Just
you know,
goes
again,
away.
for the audience, a REIT is a real estate investment trust. It's just a way for nonprofits to get together and own this real estate. And it's the same situation, and why I think this is a very interesting effort that the Ford Foundation has been very involved with for many years, and Mac, you know, particularly, is right now some of these assets are really cheap. And as we said, some of them in many ways have almost a negative value, and some, you know, financial institutions would rather not carry them as liabilities and will transfer them even with some funding to the right kind of mission-motivated entity, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit. But you do this at this kind of pricing, you can serve a lot of purposes, and you can create this set of stock that people own. They benefit to some degree from appreciation, but they agree that they won't necessarily benefit from the full amount of appreciation, so that the next occupant can go in at what's affordable. And so it's really interesting. And again, there's this sense of a moment where asset prices have gone up, but even as much as they have in some markets, they're so far below where they would likely normally be on a take out interest rates. We look at just price to income ratios, and that's a purer measure because it doesn't involve interest rates. And by our estimation, on a trend basis, we're still below on price to income. So all these, you know, things suggest it's a moment where you know, you can tie down some of these assets at attractive prices. You talk to people on Wall Street, they'll tell you the whole goal in life is to buy when things are cheap and sell when they're
Buy low,
expensive,
sell high.
right? And,
Yeah, and it
and so
sounds
for
like-
public policy, it would be nice if we were seeing this as an
Doing the
opportunity
same
to
thing.
buy
Right.
when.
And, you know, long-term debt, I mean, FHA's, it was in the report, their multifamily financing went from $2 billion in 2008 to $14.8 billion in 2012. That enabled them to finance 152,000 more units. That makes a difference. Similarly, the GSEs, the Fannie and Freddie, have been financing multifamily. And sometimes when you're in the housing finance reform debate, people assume that the multifamily market works fine and we don't actually need to worry about long-term fixed rate financing, but we do, and it's a really important element. And I know there's lots of concerns about, you know, pressure on FHA and Fannie and Freddie to pull back from that multifamily financing. So that's like a critical thing we can all take for granted. But if it goes away, all that will happen is costs will go even
Well,
higher.
and you've got that situation now. FHFA has asked Fannie and Freddie to reduce their multifamily allocations by 10%. You've got FHA, who is asking for more commitment authority right now because they're expecting to run out. We've got that situation right this second.
And the multifamily markets have tightened. You know, the largest fall in vacancy rates have been in these multifamily properties. And I think there's also a tendency, when you think about the reform of the whole housing finance system, if you create a system that makes home ownership less possible, you're really driving more people, obviously, towards renting. That is a more expensive financing system, and therefore you really are going to end up in a situation where more things are going to be in a financing system that has a higher cost of capital.
And people don't have pensions anymore, and then they don't have equity in their home. I mean, it seems like the wrong direction to a lot of people. We're getting close to the time where we're going to run out of time, but I wanted to do one more sort of round robin, if we could, kind of quick answers all the way around the panel. Fannie and Freddie have come up a bit, but certainly one of the big issues in Washington is, what do we do next? I mean, you know, both now the right and the left, we're beating up on Fannie and Freddie for sort of imploding to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, but at the same time, Freddie now is paid the entire amount back if you subtract out the interest they were supposed to pay. They have interesting accounting on that claim, but the question is, what would you like to see next? I mean, these institutions have made, whether you love them or hate them, made home ownership more affordable and more attainable for millions of Americans for generations and generations, going back to the Great Depression and coming out of the Great Depression. What comes next? What do you think we should do in replacing or reforming these institutions?
In the interest of time, I will pass and let these three.
You know, it's complicated, but you know, the 30-year fixed mortgage, absolutely an essential thing that we have to protect. And similarly on the long-term multifamily debt. I think, you know, it's really important to have a counter-cyclical authority, and, you know, especially in FHA, but also with Fannie and Freddie. We would not, you know, it's been a challenging few years. It would have been worse without that. So we cannot take that for granted. And as we design this system going forward, I think we have to be willing to say, that's why you have this. You have this when you get in a bad place, and you're trying to mitigate the risk of that. And the third is just access to credit. We know how to do home ownership the right way. We know how to mitigate risks. And we shouldn't pretend that we don't just because we had some bad actors who went too far. We know what to do right.
So you're saying we know what to do right, but Wall Street can do it right, or we need institutions involved with the government to make sure that if things get crazy, people still have access to credit.
I think that we need them to provide that final backstop, but to assume that is done by high down payments or very conservative lending, as opposed to other kinds of risk mitigation like homebuyer education and counseling, or good management, or good organizations doing that. There's lots of different ways to mitigate risk.
And simply not layering risk. A challenge was that rather than you had someone who was putting very little money down, but therefore you would be careful about how much of their income they were spending on that housing, and found you could trade these things off. There was a period of time where they were just, one risk was layered on top of another. Just simply taking that out and putting someone with a product whose mortgage payment is stable, like a fixed rate mortgage, gets you a long way there. And there's a lot of research now that demonstrates that. The debate is really going to shift, I think, at some point to what's a reasonable level of expected kind of problem loans, and how do we build to that, but realize that there's many pathways to get to that share that may have a certain likelihood of going into default. And it's not all about having to have very tight underwriting standards on several critical variables that will really critical to whether people can access credit or not all at one time, and will knock them out.
I think the regulators are going to help us determine whatever that credit box definition is. I think in terms of the future of Fannie and Freddie, there's been so many proposals, one as of this morning, I guess, and they all have a lot of commonalities in terms of this notion of private capital bearing the upfront risk, and government wrap around the security that's issued. And so lots of commonalities are developing. Who plays what role is probably the difference between all these different proposals in terms of the credit enhancements or the guarantor or whoever. I think one of the things I'll mention is the MBA is working on its own end state proposal, trying to be very thoughtful about that. But we are actually calling for some things that Fannie and Freddie or FHA can do now in anticipation, regardless of the outcome. Things like a single security, things like a common platform. We're calling for upfront risk sharing with different forms of credit enhancements, so private capital can stick their big toe back in the water. And so there's about 4 or 5 things that can be done now, regardless of the outcome in 5-7 years.
And I would say that a number of the things that Debra talked about, the regulator is doing in some way or in some fashion. The Mortgage Bankers Association has suggested some additional ways they could do it, and some things maybe they're not moving on as quickly as they could. But I strongly agree that there's a tendency to think about the future of Fannie and Freddie, but here and now, most of the mortgage credit is backstopped by FHA, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac. So there's a lot of here and now issues as opposed to what happens post them when we get around to a meaningful reform.
Yeah. We've talked about this notion that there's just no such thing as a Big Bang theory. We're going to have to take steps to get there, and so there are some things we can be doing in the short run.
But I think that we have to just kind of own up to certain facts, right? And one of the facts is that no matter how you construct it, the American taxpayer is the ultimate counterparty to whatever happens in the housing system. And it's been either explicitly by being the guarantor for FHA, of course it's with a built-in kind of mechanism to kind of fund that, or implicitly with the implicit guarantee that Freddie and Fannie ended up calling when things went bad. And if we own up to that, and then we get to some kind of clarity over what role the government should be playing in making the market work, which is both as the watchdog, with the right kind of regulatory authority, exercised right, making sure that there's alignment of incentives from bottom to top through the whole market, which is what really went wrong when you think about the misaligned incentives at almost every level is what led to the housing crisis in the first place. And making sure that the right people are served by the system. Because the system that's kind of that has the American taxpayer as a counterparty should actually then do its job of actually serving the housing needs of the system. I don't think we go back to a time when we don't have global private capital participating in our housing system. I think that there are lots and lots of good things about opening your housing markets to private capital. It makes for lots of liquidity when you don't have domestic liquidity. It makes for lots of opportunities to do things you wouldn't otherwise do. But you have to regulate it. It just can't be, the Wild West like it was in 2006. And really, it was a Wild West starting about, the Wild West started when we deregulated in 1998 with, Graham Leach Bliley, right? If we're really clear about that and we really kind of just own up to it, I think we can find a way to actually get the system to work right. And we have tens of millions of examples of successful contracts worked out in single-family markets with homeowners that have worked even now, right? And in multifamily, we know how to do this. It's not like we have to reinvent the way we do housing, right? We just have to be disciplined. And if we could get to the point where we could exert discipline on ourselves and discipline on all our counterparties, then we'll be a far sight better off. And I think that we're going to have both a private and a public way to access global capital markets, right?
All right, well, I think that's a good way to kind of a global way to end it. And thank you to all of our excellent panelists for such a lively discussion. I think it was actually very interesting. Anytime I talk with Eric about this stuff, we talk for a long time, and I find it really helpful as a reporter. And it's a big issue, I think, for all of America. Most people own a home, and if they don't, they rent one. So online viewers can continue the conversation on Twitter using, again, the hashtag Harvard Housing Report, and you can also download the report itself on the Joint Center website, which is www.jchs.harvard.edu. That's the Joint Center for Housing Studies, is the acronym you might not remember. Thanks again to all of our speakers, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.